Before we begin, take a moment to get comfortable. Let your arms go heavy, your breath slow. And as you listen, feel free to leave a comment sharing what time it is, where you are, and what city or village you're listening from. It's love to know. And if you'd like more quiet stories like this one, don't forget to subscribe so they gently appear when you need them most. Now, let's begin. You have to imagine the market, not as it was on the day of celebration, but on the day after. Not when crowds gathered for a festival, nor when ships unloaded goods from distant shores. No, the day you need to picture is a quiet morning after, a public execution, not of a general, not of a tyrant, but of an old man who used to ask questions, the execution of Socrates. He wasn't the kind of man to lead armies or build walls. He didn't write books. He didn't own land, didn't serve in high office. And yet, somehow, his death left the whole city a little quieter, not because people were weeping, but because they were listening, to themselves, and because no one wanted to be caught asking the wrong thing. If you had walked through the agora that morning, the central square of Athens, the sun would have looked the same. A soft glare reflected off-white stone. Merchants fussed with stalls of oil jars and sandals, and pigeons fluttered near abandoned crumbs. But beneath the sandals and the tunics, beneath the polished faces and the measured words, there was something missing. People were choosing not to say things. They still greeted one another. They still bartered, but the kinds of questions Socrates had asked, casual ones that unraveled a man's beliefs, the gentle inquiries that exposed the weak corners of logic, those had vanished like smoke. And so had the shoemaker's customer. His name is not recorded, but the shoemaker's shop, Kai, like many others, faced one of the quieter lanes off the main square. He wasn't poor, but not wealthy either. His fingers were rough, stained with dye, and a small bronze anvil sat near the door. His shop was where many types of people came: soldiers, slaves, tutors, merchants, and sometimes, in the last few years, men who listened to Socrates. They would speak of ideas on being fitted for new souls. They would debate the meaning of courage while measuring sandals, and they would often leave with shoes they never paid for, lost in thought. The shoemaker didn't mind. He liked to talk, but after the trial, it stopped. Not the business, the questions. People in Athens didn't call it philosophy, it's the way you might today. They called it speaking too long in the sun. They called it being clever. They called it asking like Socrates. And in the weeks following his death, after the hemlock, after the trial, after the speech that Plato would write down in full, but others quietly forgot, the streets of Athens began to change. Conversations grew shorter. Public debates became recitations of approved laws. And people who had once leaned forward to listen began looking over their shoulders instead. No one banned questions. They didn't need to. They just made sure it was dangerous to ask them aloud. The shoemaker's neighbor, a man who sold olives and dried cheese, once said to him, "Say Socrates called himself a gadfly." The shoemaker, pressing a nail into a sandal, didn't look up. "A pest," the neighbor continued. "That's what a gadfly is." The shoemaker nodded, slowly. "And what does that make the horse?" The olive seller frowned. "What horse?" Shoemaker looked at him directly, the way Socrates used to look at people. "The city." Neither of them said anything after that, and the next day, the olive man moved his stall to another lane. The thing about Athens in that era is not that it was full of fear, but that it was full of contradiction. This was the birthplace of democracy, but it had also voted to kill a man for speaking. This was the city of wisdom, but it had, in its courts, decided that asking too many questions was a kind of corruption, and the people knew it. They knew, in that small, buried part of the mind that wakes up first and sleeps last, that something had changed. The shoemaker knew it when he stopped asking customers how they walked. He used to ask, Do you walk quickly or carefully? So he could fit them better now. He just measured. He didn't want them thinking he meant something else. The effect of Socrates' death was not immediate like a fire. It was slow, like water rising under floorboards. Teachers revised their lessons. Students chose different mentors. Parents told their children it is better to answer than to ask. And in homes where once people had argued about justice or piety or the difference between courage and arrogance, in those homes there was only one rule: don't ask questions that make people uncomfortable, even if they are true. Especially if they are true. One of the last customers to visit the shoemaker's shop in that early season after the execution was a man in a fine tunic. Not too rich, not too poor. He had a quiet way of entering, looked around the shop, noticed the sandals lined in rows. He tried on a pair. The shoemaker knelt to check the fit. Too tight, he asked. The man looked down. What is tight? He said, carefully. The shoemaker paused. For a moment, the air seemed to still. He thought about how Socrates might have answered. He thought about what it might mean if he said too much. And then he said only, smaller than comfort. The man nodded, paid his coin, and left. The shoemaker never saw him again. It would be easy to think that people stopped asking questions because they were afraid of death. But that's not quite it. They were afraid of becoming a problem, of being pointed out in the agora, of being marked in quiet conversations, of being described later in court as one who disturbs. The punishment wasn't just hemlock, it was distance. People who asked the wrong things found themselves slowly erased, not violently, but bureaucratic ally left out of invitations, moved from posts, forgotten in voting rosters. It was quieter than exile, but it worked. And so the shoemaker worked on his shop, remained open. His fingers grew stiffer with age. The sandals changed shape slightly as fashions drifted. But no one ever asked him again what he thought of Socrates. No one ever said the name dot, and in time, the silence around it became stronger than the man had ever been in life. People knew not to disturb it, even in private, even in shops, even with friends. But one night, long after the stalls had been shuttered and the fires banked low, the shoemaker sat alone and took out a scrap of leather. Not for sandals. For memory, he traced a line along its edge. A circle, a question mark, an unfinished sentence, and then he tucked it beneath the floorboard, under the anvil, where no one would see it. Not because it was valuable, but because it still mattered to him. Someone had once asked something dangerous, and that the question still had no answer. The market square of Athens was never silent. Not really. Even after Socrates was executed, the city thrummed with life. A chorus of voices, always blending, contradicting, weaving into the fabric of everyday existence. But after his death, something subtle had shifted in the rhythm. A quietness hung over the agora, a stillness in how people walked, how they spoke, and, more importantly, what they no longer said. The shoemaker noticed it first in the way his customers entered his shop. They no longer greeted him with the familiar ease of a friend. Instead, they entered carefully, almost as if measuring their words before they spoke. The space between hello and what do you need became an uncomfortable pause, filled with unspoken understanding. He had long been accustomed to the small talk of his trade. A person's feet could reveal much about them: how they walked, how they worked, whether they stood tall or hunched over. The questions he asked were never intrusive. They were a part of the routine of fitting shoes, measuring soles, making sure that every stitch was correct. But now, every inquiry felt like an interrogation, a search for something that had been lost, or perhaps something that was best left untouched. One day, a man entered the shop who had once been a regular customer. His name was Pericles, not the famous politician, but a middle-class merchant who dealt in imported spices. He had been a staunch supporter of Socrates, often joining in the philosophical debates in the agora when the old philosopher was still alive. Pericles had a broad smile and a quick laugh, traits that had once made him one of the shoemaker's more talkative customers. But that day, he came in quietly. He didn't smile. He didn't speak immediately. Simply took a seat on the stool by the counter, waiting. The shoemaker looked up from his work. "Are you in need of new shoes today, Pericles?" Key asked gently, knowing the answer. He had noticed the worn soles of the man's sandals long before Pericles had entered. Pericles nodded, but didn't respond. The shoemaker continued to work in silence, the sound of his needle pulling thread through leather punctuating the quiet. He'd never been one for idle chatter, but he felt the weight of the stillness. Finally, after a long pause, Pericles spoke. "You know, they say things will return to normal in time," he said, his voice low and hesitant. The shoemaker didn't look up. He had heard this line before, whispered in corners by those who had once been part of Socrates' circle. "Normal?" he asked, his fingers still steady on the leather. Pericles shifted in his seat, clearly uncomfortable. "Well, yes, people. We'll forget what happened. Things will go back to the way they were before." "Will they?" The shoemaker's voice was soft, but it carried an edge. For the first time, Pericles met his gaze, and the weight of his silence seemed to grow heavier. He shifted again, his fingers twitching at his sides. "I suppose they must," Pericles said, his voice almost pleading. But the shoemaker was not interested in reassurances. His gaze stayed on the sandals in front of him, the simple leather straps, now looking almost like relics from another world. There was something about the way Pericles spoke that felt like a lie. He was trying to believe what he was saying, but he couldn't. Not really. No one could. The silence between them stretched. Finally, the shoemaker asked, "Do you remember the questions Socrates used to ask?" Pericles stiffened. "The ones that made us all stop and think," the shoemaker continued. "The ones that made us uncomfortable, made us rethink everything. The ones we could never answer." "I remember," Pericles said quietly, his voice almost a whisper. "But those days are over, are they?" the shoemaker asked, leaning forward slightly. Pericles looked at the ground, his eyes tracing a circle in the dust. He didn't respond immediately. The shoemaker waited. Finally, Pericles muttered, "It's not the same. It's too dangerous to ask questions like that now. People are afraid." "Afraid of what?" the shoemaker pressed, still stitching. Pericles hesitated again before answering. "Of being wrong, of looking foolish, of ... being punished." The shoemaker didn't respond. Instead, he went back to his work, the needle moving in rhythm, his hands steady and purposeful. Pericles fidgeted in his seat, glancing at the door, then at the sandals on the counter. He seemed to grow smaller, more withdrawn as the minutes passed. After a long silence, Pericles finally stood. "I'll take the sandals," he said, his voice stiff, as if he was trying to convince himself. The shoemaker handed him the shoes, his gaze never leaving the task in front of him. Pericles hesitated before reaching for his coin pouch. He looked at the shoemaker one last time, then quickly left the shop, his footsteps fading into the distance. The days that followed were quiet. The shoemaker noticed fewer and fewer people coming to the market to debate. Fewer voices filled the agora. Those who did meet only exchanged pleasantries or discussed mundane matters, the price of grain, the harvests, the condition of the roads. Any mention of Socrates, even in passing, was avoided. There was no talk of philosophy, no intellectual banter. It was as if the city had collectively agreed to forget. And yet, the shoemaker couldn't shake the feeling that something had been lost. Something irreplaceable. The lightness of being able to ask freely, to challenge, to wonder, to question the nature of virtue, or justice, or knowledge itself. It was all gone now. One evening, As the sun dipped low over the horizon, the shoemaker closed his shop and began to walk toward his modest home on the outskirts of Athens. As he passed through the quiet streets, he found himself wandering toward the agora, the heart of the city, where once the loudest conversations had taken place. Now it was silent, the familiar sounds of voices discussing the ideas of the day now gone. The children who used to play in the square had been told to quiet down, to stop making too much noise. Everything seemed muted. As the shoemaker stood in the center of the agora, he felt the weight of the emptiness. It wasn't just the absence of questions, it was the absence of curiosity. The city had been filled with life, with people asking, debating, seeking truth, and now that was all gone. Was it truly over? Was Athens still the city of ideas, or had it become just another place to go about daily life, without meaning, without questioning? He stood there for a long while, watching the last light fade, feeling the quiet like a weight pressing on him. Would the city ever return to the way it was, when asking questions was the highest form of living? Or had Socrates' death truly marked the end of an era, the death of philosophy itself in Athens? The morning after that walk through the agora, the shoemaker returned to his workbench like he always did. He lit the small oil lamp above his stitching post, not because he needed the light the sun had already climbed, but because it made the room feel familiar, grounded. The lamp's flicker steadied him, like the rhythm of thread through leather, like the weight of sandals waiting for soles. But something in him had changed. He watched the street more now, not in fear, not in longing, just in observation. Athens was changing again, slowly. You could sense it in the way people's eyes flicked toward statues and shrines, checking for permission, in how long they hesitated before answering a question, even a simple one, like, how much for the olives today? Or, did it rain last night in Paris? It wasn't that they didn't know. It was that they weren't sure if they were allowed to know. The shoemaker understood this fear more than he cared to admit. After all, what had Socrates really done? He had walked the streets, asking questions. He had made people doubt their answers, look deeper, admit ignorance. He had embarrassed powerful men without lifting a sword or writing a law, and for that, he had been executed. No one wanted to be the next name on a list, and so Athens quieted. It wasn't just the streets that changed. It was the homes. Inside courtyards, once filled with spirited conversation, discussions now circled shallow topics. Whose son had joined the Navy? What the baker charged for barley bread? Whether the new tax on market stalls would be permanent? Nobody asked why the tax had been levied. Nobody wondered how long it would last. Even the children played differently. Where once they might have imitated courtroom debates or pretended to be philosophers arguing over truth, now they reenacted soldier drills or marketplace haggling. They mimicked action, not thought. One afternoon, the shoemaker overheard a boy ask his friend, "Why did Socrates have to die?" The other boy looked around quickly, then whispered, "Don't ask that." And they ran off, laughing too loudly. The kind of laughter children use when they're frightened and don't know how else to hide it. Not long after, the shoemaker received a visit from a woman he had not seen in years. Her name was Xanthi. Once, she had been the wife of a stonemason who worked on the Parthenon, a strong, silent man with large hands and a quiet reverence for marble. She had been known for her sharp eyes and sharper memory, often quoting lines of philosophy in the market square, always from memory, never from scrolls. But that day, she was pale, thinner. She sat on the edge of the shop's bench, as if afraid to put too much of her weight anywhere. "I need sandals for my youngest," she said softly. "The ones you made for his brother. They lasted 5 years." The shoemaker nodded and gestured for her to sit properly. He didn't ask about her husband. He had heard the rumors, conscripted, maybe killed in a skirmish, or vanished in the post-war purges. No one asked for details anymore. His asking had become dangerous as he measured the child's feet. She watched him with a strange intensity. Finally, she asked, "Do you remember what Socrates used to say about the unexamined life?" The shoemaker paused, his thread taut in his fingers. "I remember," he said quietly. "And do you think we're living that now?" she asked. "An unexamined life?" He looked up at her. It would have been easier to say nothing, to change the subject, to talk about leather or dye, or the recent price of sheep gut for stitching thread. But instead, he said, "I think we're living something quieter than that." She didn't ask what he meant. She just nodded. Her eyes lowered to her lap, where she twisted her fingers together, her knuckles white. That night, the shoemaker sat by his oil lamp and opened the drawer where he kept scraps, not of leather, but of thoughts. He'd never been a writer. Not really, but sometimes after particularly frustrating days, he would jot things down, fragments of conversations. Questions he wished he had asked. Names of people he missed. He pulled out one of the scraps. On it was written, "How do you measure a city's silence?" He stared at the words for a long time. Then, slowly, he picked up a fresh piece of parchment. "Today, 3 people came to the shop. None asked about Socrates. One asked if he had known him. I said no. I don't know why I lied." He folded the parchment, tucked it into the drawer, and blew out the lamp. In the months that followed, a strange pattern emerged across the city. Quiet resistance, not protests, not speeches, just tiny things. A coin left at the base of Socrates' former speaking spot in the agora. Not large, not obvious, just enough to mean something to someone who knew to look. A scratched letter on the side of a column, Sigma, Omega Chi, the start of his name, is hidden beneath a vine or behind a vendor's basket. Once, the shoemaker saw a man pause at a public fountain, look both ways, then mutter aloud, "What is justice?" and then walk away, as if saying the question itself was an act of defiance, or maybe grief. One day, the shoemaker was visited by a young boy, barely old enough for proper sandals, holding a scroll in trembling hands. "My father says you knew the old man," the boy said. The shoemaker raised an eyebrow. "Which old man?" The boy hesitated, then whispered, "The one who asked too many questions." The shoemaker looked at the scroll. The boy held it like it might explode. "I'm not supposed to have this," the boy added. The shoemaker reached forward gently, taking the scroll and unrolling it just slightly. The words were familiar. Not Socrates, but Plato's, one of the early dialogues. The ink was faded, the edges burned. He looked at the boy. "Why bring this to me?" he asked. The boy shrugged. "'Cause my father said you wouldn't be." "Afraid?" The shoemaker said nothing for a long moment. Then he rolled up the scroll, handed it back carefully, and said, "Hide it well. And when you're older, read it aloud." The boy's eyes lit up, not in triumph, but in relief. Someone had finally acknowledged the truth. He ran off, clutching the scroll to his chest. The shoemaker watched him go, then turned back to his bench and his leather. He had shoes to finish, feet to protect, but now he also had a quiet, impossible hope that one day questions would be asked again, not in whispers, but in the open, not in fear, but in wonder. Athens would never be the same again, but neither would the shoemaker. He would never again pretend that questions didn't matter, even if he couldn't ask them aloud, even if his only resistance was in refusing to forget. He never wrote long speeches or inscribed stone tablets, but in the quiet memory of every student who passed his shop, in every foot he fitted for wandering, he left a legacy that sometimes the most dangerous question is the one that's never asked, and the most powerful answer is silence that refuses to forget. It began, as so many stories do in Athens, not with a pronouncement or proclamation, but with a gap. Plato, the student of Socrates, the architect of the academy, the philosopher who sculpted thought into dialogue, had written nearly everything he intended to say in careful form. Conversations framed like theater, ideas given breath through characters, question each other across time. But there was one conversation that didn't exist. No one could quite say what it was supposed to be about. No name had been etched onto the scroll. No titles listed it in early libraries, but the absence was unmistakable. Like a book pulled from a shelf that still left behind the scent of old paper, the missing dialogue, and not just any dialogue. The final one, Plato had written more than 20 dialogues by the time his reputation was cemented, from the Apology, which gave voice to Socrates' trial, to the Republic, which laid out a vision of an ideal city. He captured the logic of love in the Symposium, the origins of the soul in the Phaedrus, and the nature of justice in the Gorgias stat. Each work had a rhythm, a structure, a cast, but in his final years, something shifted. The dialogues became darker, less Socratic. In Laws, Chaos, his last and longest work, Socrates was nowhere to be found. The voice of reason had gone silent, placed by unnamed characters wandering through the dry mechanics of legislation, and then silence. A silence not just of the voice, but of the form itself. No last question, no final conversation, no farewell. You might ask, how do you know a thing is missing when it was never written? That's the curious part. In letters attributed to Plato, though their authenticity is debated, there are passing references to an unfinished dialogue or work held back for later eyes. One passage in a letter to Dion hints at a truth too sharp for the page. Another refers cryptically to the dangerous question which cannot be asked in daylight. Modern scholars, careful not to stretch the facts, tend to dismiss these lines as metaphor or the projection of later interpreters, but the pattern remains in the margins of ancient commentaries on Plato's works. Scribes left notes like, see, also, the unwritten laws. Compare with the silent dialogue was meant to follow the treatise. Again and again, these suggestions converge, not on a specific title, but on the sense of something withheld, something too unstable to inscribe. One of the strangest clues comes from the temple library at Pergamon. Among its fragmentary catalogs is a list of philosophical scrolls copied from Athens by early scholars under the reign of Attalus. Each entry includes a title, a format, and an estimated number of lines. Most of the entries match known works, Phaedo, Republic, Meno, but near the bottom is an unnamed entry, listed only as dialogue of the Athenian lines, unknown, contents, restricted. Next to it, in a later hand, someone has added, possibly last, Why would a dialogue, supposedly fictional, philosophical, harmless, be considered restricted? Why would its contents go unlisted? Why, in a tradition devoted to reason and openness, would anything be too dangerous to speak? A theory emerged in the 19th century, passed quietly among scholars of classical thought, that Plato had indeed written a final dialogue, or at least prepared one, had destroyed it, not out of fear, but out of responsibility. The idea was that Plato had finally reached a conclusion so destabilizing, so corrosive to the foundation of Athenian life, that to express it would have been to pull the thread from which the whole fabric unraveled. He had once watched Socrates die for asking questions. He knew what the city could do when its people were made to look in the mirror. And so, the theory goes, he chose silence, a dialogue not written, a truth preserved only by omission. One fragment, however, challenges this theory at the bottom of a worn-out scroll found in Herculaneum, now partially translated thanks to multispectral imaging is a line scribbled in a hand resembling Plato's. It's not certain, of course. Could the ink, the formation of letters, the papyrus type, all suggest someone of the Platonic circle? The line reads, "What is the question that silences the soul and yet cannot be refused?" It is written with no punctuation, no surrounding context, no preamble or follow dash up, just a sentence. Sitting alone, waiting. This line has fueled endless speculation. Some say it refers to death, the only question all must answer. Others think it refers to knowledge, the awareness that one knows nothing. But a smaller group of philosophers, both ancient and modern, argue it was a political question, something about the city, the state, the way power moves when no one is looking, perhaps even the right to rule itself. They point to Plato's growing disillusionment near the end of his life, the long exile from practical politics, the failure of his attempts to guide real rulers, the collapse of his ideal city into endless theory. They argue Plato saw too quickly what happens when knowledge is placed in the hands of those who cannot bear it. And so he wrote nothing, because writing, once released, cannot be undone, and ideas, once read, cannot be recalled. Today, we still search for the missing dialogue in Ashfield, libraries and scattered fragments, and echoes between the lines of what was written. But maybe we're asking the wrong question. Maybe the real issue isn't what Plato didn't write. Maybe it's why he stopped. What was it he saw? What did he conclude that made him fold the parchment closed and never open it again? And would we understand it or endure it if we read it now? It is a curious thing, this absence, in a culture that wrote so much on papyrus, on stone, on memory. To lose something so central feels almost deliberate. But maybe that's the point. You're sitting now in the quiet hush of the academy, not the grand stone complex later imagined in paintings, but the original grove of trees, wild and low-slung, dotted with sandaled footprints and simple benches carved from river rock. This was where Plato taught, beneath the shadows of olive trees, where his students gathered, not for exams, but for wandering thoughts. The grove was real. Its earth had worn paths. Its air had carried conversations. But what passed between minds didn't always make it to the page. It is here that the idea of the unwritten doctrine began to take shape. In the years after Plato's death, his most devoted students, Speusippus, Socrates, later Aristotle, passed on more than the texts. They passed on the teaching style, the manner, the withheld conclusions. According to several later philosophers, what Plato said aloud was different from what he committed to writing. The dialogues were public, thought, structured, palatable, sometimes playful, but the real lessons, they said, were spoken in secret, reserved for the initiated, shared only after years of preparation. Never before one was ready. Aristotle, never one for mystical fog, once remarked that Plato's written works were like introductory exercises compared to the deeper doctrines. Later writers, Diogenes, Largus, Simplices, echoed the rumor of these unwritten teachings. A fragment of Simplicius' commentary on Aristotle contains the following. There are among the ancients some who say Plato did not wish to commit the most sacred questions to paper, for he feared they would fall into unworthy hands and be misunderstood, or worse, used. It sounds dramatic, yes, but then again, isn't that what happened to Socrates? Let us suppose, just for a moment, that Plato had written the missing dialogue and then chose to destroy it. What might have been in it? Not a myth, not a story, but a question so volatile, so corrosive to structure, that it could not survive in scroll form. Some scholars have proposed it might have been about the nature of law. In his earlier dialogues, Plato teases the idea that laws are useful only if they move the soul toward justice, not just obedience. But what happens when law hardens into ritual? When it exists not to guide, but to preserve the status quo? He had seen it himself, how the same city that produced the most celebrated thinkers also sentenced them to death. What if, in his final years, Plato asked, can the state exist without deception? Or is the city a lie we all agree to believe? The dialogue Critias, which breaks off mid-sentence, is often seen as an unfinished piece, the one where Atlantis is described, but never concluded. Critics have long debated whether Plato intended to finish it or abandon it. But a curious detail: the story of Atlantis in Critias is framed not as myth, but as historical memory passed down through priests. It involves a civilization destroyed not by invasion, but by its own pride and corruption. It becomes a mirror, not a fantasy, but of Athens. Could it be that the missing dialogue was meant to follow Critias, to lay bare not just the fall of Atlantis, but the fall of all civilizations? Could that have been Plato's final move to dismantle the very notion of ideal society he had spent a lifetime building? A dialogue that asks, what if the city cannot be saved? What if, at its core, it is built on a necessary silence, the refusal to ask? One scrap of papyrus from the Oxyrhynchus collection contains a curious exchange between two unnamed speakers. It is not attributed to Plato, but it echoes his structure. Speaker A: then must we not examine the city's root? Speaker B: but what if the route is concealment? Speaker A: then shall we not uncover it? Speaker B: only if we are prepared to lose the fruit. This might seem abstract, even fabricated, but it resonates with something Plato once wrote in Phaedrus, that writing, unlike spoken conversation, rolls about everywhere, reaching those with understanding no more than those without. That writing is dumb, unable to defend itself, that only the living dialogue person to person can adapt, correct, and guide. Maybe he meant it. Maybe he meant it so deeply that his final lesson was not to write. The silence became contagious. For nearly 2 centuries after Plato's death, his immediate successors in the academy wrote very little. We have fragments, yes, and some testimonies, but no full dialogues, no bold declarations. It's just echoes. Arcesilaus, who led the academy in the 3rd century BCE, said to have taught exclusively through spoken contradiction. No dogma, no certainty, only questions. The missing dialogue, it seems, spawned a tradition of silence, not from ignorance, but from reverence for the question that should not be answered. So where does that leave us? With a possibility and a whisper. Not a lost book, but an intentional absence. Not a forgotten lesson, but a withheld one. And it is here that your own role enters, as reader, as listener, as participant in this quiet legacy. Because if the most dangerous question was never written, you might still ask it. You might stumble into it like a child walking through the academy grove, kicking at the roots, and finding a piece of carved stone that says nothing and everything. And so the silence continues, not as emptiness, but as invitation. Let's walk now through time, not with certainty, but with patience, past the echoes of the academy and into the long shadow it cast over centuries of thought. The silence left by Plato's unwritten dialogue did not vanish. It was carried, piece by piece, by those who came after, in whispered speculation, keen commentary margins, and questions asked quietly beneath the hum of doctrine. The irony, of course, is that the dialogue no one read might be the one that shaped everything. This is the paradox that haunts historians, especially those drawn to philosophy. The things that matter most are often those least recorded. The real beliefs of Plato, the tone of his voice when he spoke, the glint in his eye when he refused to answer. Let us begin with what we know, or rather, what those closest to Plato believed they knew. Aristotle, his most famous student, left no record of a missing dialogue, but he left something more telling. A method in metaphysics. He writes of first principles, the unmovable truths upon which other truths rest. And yet, the more he pursues these principles, the less certain they seem. Aristotle would build an entire intellectual empire out of structured knowledge. But even he returned, again and again, to the question of beginnings. How can one explain everything without collapsing into paradox? It's as if Aristotle inherited the aftermath of an unanswered question, one too difficult even for Plato to resolve in writing. Later thinkers noticed this tension. They called it Plato's hesitation, not moral hesitation, not cowardice, but philosophical restraint, a reluctance to reduce the most dangerous insights to ink and parchment. One of the most persistent theories is that Plato's missing dialogue wasn't about politics or cosmology, but about language itself. In the dialogue, Cratylus, Plato explores the relationship between words and things. Do names have a natural connection to the objects they describe, or are they merely agreed upon signs? He plays with etymology, pokes at the absurdity of arbitrary names, and ultimately leaves the matter unresolved. But what if that dialogue was only a prelude? What if Plato began to wonder, not just whether names were arbitrary, but whether all speech was, whether anything meaningful could ever be captured in language? If so, the final dialogue would have taken the terrifying step of undermining all the others. It would have said, this, too, is illusion. These words, these forms, all of them are shadows on the cave wall. That kind of dialogue, if it ever existed, could never be read without shaking the reader's faith in reason itself, which might explain why it doesn't exist. There are clues elsewhere, though, in the writings of the Neoplatonist Plotinus, Porphyry, Proclus, who believed that the highest truths could only be grasped through direct inner vision. They taught that the one, the source of all being, was beyond description, beyond thought. Words could only point toward it. Clients pointing into fog, Plotinus, in particular, seemed to regard Plato as a mystic who cloaked his most sacred ideas in deliberate layers. His student Porphyry claimed that the dialogues were structured like initiations, each one preparing the reader for deeper revelations. According to this view, the final revelation would not come in a scroll. It would come in silence, and perhaps that's what Plato intended to stop, not because he had nothing more to say, but because what remained could not be said. The philosopher Sextus Empiricus, writing in the 2nd century C, had a different interpretation. He believed Plato stopped short, not out of reverence, but as a practical strategy, that the final dialogue was unwritten because it was meant to be enacted by the reader, that the dialogues were not lectures, but exercises, traps, devices meant to leave the reader in a state of productive confusion. According to Sextus, final lesson was this: to accept not knowing, to live inside the question, to let go of the desire for final answers. This wasn't nihilism. It was something quieter, softer, a way of thinking that didn't destroy belief, but hollowed it out, just enough to let wisdom pass through. And what about the Christian philosophers? Augustine, raised on classical thought, wrestled with Plato's silences. In Confessions, he recalls the pool of Platonic ideas, how they brought him close to truth, but never all the way to peace. He admired Plato, but found his silence troubling. Where was the certainty, the revelation? Later, medieval scholars began calling the missing dialogue the forbidden knowledge of the ancients. Some believed it was destroyed during the fires that swept the Library of Alexandria. Others thought it was hidden in the Vatican, locked behind doors marked not with names, but with numbers. A few went further, claiming the missing dialogue had been found, but that reading it led only to madness. These are legends, of course, but legends, like silences, exist for a reason. The idea of a missing dialogue has even found its way into modern philosophy in the 20th century. Thinkers like Derrida, Wittgenstein, and Foucault returned to Plato, not to praise him, but to dig into his gaps. They saw in his silence not failure, but strategy. Wittgenstein famously wrote, "Whereof one cannot speak, thereof one must be silent." It could have been Plato's motto. Derrida argued that Plato's writing performs absence, that his dialogues are haunted by what they don't say. Foucault, ever suspicious of systems, saw the unwritten dialogue as evidence that all thought systems contain their own undoing, like a map that folds in on itself. In each case, the conclusion is the same. The missing dialogue was not a mistake. It was the climax, the vanishing point of certainty. And what does this mean for you? Sitting here in the quiet, trying to fall asleep to history. It means that sometimes the most important historical events aren't what happened, but what almost did. Not what was said, but what was held back. Not what was written, but what someone chose with full knowledge and intent not to write. We often think of history as a record, a ledger of events, a list of what people did, but it is also deeply a history of restraint, of silences kept, of questions that went unanswered, not because they couldn't be answered, but because to answer them would have unraveled the fragile threads that held up culture together. Maybe that was Plato's gift, not a final truth, but a final pause, an unfinished sentence at the end of a long conversation. And it is up to each generation, including yours, to decide whether to finish it or to let it remain beautifully, permanently, a link. You hear the voices before you see the faces, slippers on marble, low murmurs, the echo of sandals in the colonnade. The city is Athens, but not the one of empire, the one of trial and dust, the one that has just lost its teacher. Socrates is gone, the hemlock has done its work, the prison has emptied. The silence afterward is not heavy, not yet, but scattered, uncertain, like leaves stirred by a breeze that hasn't decided where it's going. You are a boy in this story, but not a famous one, not a name the scrolls recorded, not a student giving speeches in dialogues. But you were there in the back of the stoa, the portico, near the shade, where grown men debated. You didn't ask questions, you listened. You heard everything. At the time of Socrates' death in 399 BCE, you were just old enough to remember his voice clearly, not the rhetoric, the rhythms. He spoke like no one else. He didn't project. He didn't declare. He didn't answer. He asked, and the city didn't like that. The accusation was then impiety, corrupting the youth. But everyone understood the deeper charge. Socrates made people doubt, not gods, not even politics. Hey, he made them doubt certainty. You watched as older boys were pulled away from the agora by their fathers. You overheard mothers whispering warnings. Taint, don't listen to the man in the robe. He'll unmake your thoughts. But you had already listened. The day after his death, the philosophers scattered. Some walked alone down the long walls toward the port. Some left for Thebes. Others, the youngest, the closest, gathered in a small house near the temple of Hephaestus. There was no plaque on the door, no schedule. But they returned, again and again, drawn by what wasn't finished. They called it a memorial, but it became something else. You were too young to join, but you sat nearby, each morning, pretending to fetch bread or carry figs. You positioned yourself outside the window. The shutters were thin, and you heard. Plato was there, but quiet. He had been absent at the trial, sick during the execution. He said little, wrote nothing, at least not yet. Instead, the loudest voice belonged to Apollodorus, the most emotional of the group. He cried often, spoke with too much volume. I was there, he said, again and again. I saw him drink it. I saw him smile. But what he remembered wasn't what Socrates said in his final moments. It was what he said before. He told me, Apollodorus recalled, that no one learns through answers, only questions. It's that a soul grows not by what it knows, but by what it realizes it doesn't. The others nodded. It wasn't new, but somehow, now that Socrates was gone, the old words took on new shape. Echocrates, a visitor from Phlius, said. He had begun collecting recollections. Not the public stuff, he said. Not the dialogues and stories. The habits. The patterns. What time he woke up. Whether he bathed before debate, tea, eat figs, or olives first. He was serious. It sounded ridiculous, recording whether Socrates wiped his mouth with the back of his hand or his sleeve. But there was something comforting in it. You remember one line Echocrates repeated over and over, written into a small scroll. He never answered quickly, not even when he knew the answer. This was the kind of thing no one thought to write down until afterward. But afterward was all that mattered. Plato began writing not long after. Not from memory, at least, not exactly. His dialogues often blurred reality and imagination. Socrates, as speaker, yes, but also as symbol. In Phaedrus, he spoke of love as divine madness. In the Republic, he designed a city built on justice and hierarchy. And in Apology, he gave Socrates the final words that echoed louder than the trial itself. But some of the older students, like Crito, didn't agree with how Plato remembered him. He's too neat, Crito said once. Too perfect. That wasn't him. Crito's Socrates was more awkward, more clumsy in speech, more prone to pauses. It's a kind of man who forgot what he was saying halfway through, then circled back and laughed. He didn't teach, Crito said. He made you feel like you had discovered something on your own. That was the part that mattered. You, the boy who listened, began to realize what was being lost. Not facts, not philosophy, but tone, the grain of voice, the raised eyebrow, the way Socrates would scratch the side of his head when no one answered. The chuckle he'd let slip when someone tried to sound smarter than they were. You remembered those things. They weren't written anywhere. They never would be, but they made the man real. Years passed. You grew up. The academy was founded. Plato moved his teachings into structure, into lectures, into categories. Later, students asked questions about the soul, the forms, the structure of knowledge. But fewer remembered how Socrates leaned on one leg when he was tired, how he sometimes stopped speaking mid-thought just to smell the breeze, how he always waited longer than was comfortable before replying, because that, too, was part of the question, and the question was always the point. In your 40s, you wrote nothing. You became a cobbler. You had 3 children, all of them uninterested in philosophy, but sometimes, late at night, when the shop was closed, you would repeat his old phrases to yourself. Tell me, what is justice? Okay? What is the good? You didn't have answers, but you didn't need them. The voice was enough. You remembered the day Socrates asked a potter, "Is a well-made bowl more noble than a broken statue?" The potter didn't answer, just laughed. You remembered that laugh more clearly than any book, because in that laugh was the whole of philosophy. What happens to a voice after it is gone? What happens to the sound of a man who asks dangerous questions, not to destroy, but to awaken? Does it live in memory, in ritual, in books, or in the boy who sat quietly outside, pretending not to listen? This is what the historians don't record, but it is history, just the same. It is the slow, quiet survival of a way of thinking, not in academies or scrolls, but in habits, voices, small, daily pauses, the kind Socrates made, the kind you remember, even now, even still, and still. By now, you are older, huh? The boy who used to sit outside the colonnade has become the man who walks it. You no longer pretend to run errands just to be near the philosophers. You have a stall of your own in the agora, and your sons run it now. They count coins, you count years. But still, when you pass that shaded spot in the late morning, when the sun hasn't yet heated the stones, You slow down. You listen for a voice that isn't there. And sometimes, that space between memory and echo, you hear it. Not Socrates himself, but the others. His students, his friends. The ones who tried to remember what could not be remembered. You've come to realize something. Socrates didn't teach philosophy. He taught forgetting. Forgetting what you thought you knew. Forgetting your pride. Forgetting even that you were supposed to win an argument. And the ones who knew that best are the ones history barely mentions. You remember, for example, Aeschines of Sphetus. Not Aeschines, the orator, the other one, the minor one, a follower of Socrates whose name never made it into the grand libraries. He didn't write dialogues that echoed through Rome. He left fragments, calf-quotes, but Aeschines was there. He once said Socrates called him the sponge, not because he absorbed knowledge, but because he soaked up other people's errors. He wrote about how Socrates spent long hours in silence, just watching people. Not judging, not mocking, just watching. There was a lesson in that, Aeschines said, though no one ever named it. And then Aeschines disappeared from history. No exile, no crime, just silence, like so many others. Then there was Antisones. He remembered Socrates with sharpness, like a man who could not forget even if he wanted to. He told stories others found uncomfortable, that Socrates didn't always smell pleasant, that he sometimes said contradictory things and refused to explain. But Antisones, his own way, revered that. He began teaching in the Synesarges, a gymnasium outside the city proper, to those too poor or too foreign for the academy. His version of Socratic thought was stripped down, ascetic. He taught that virtue was the only good and that comfort was a trap. Once, you heard Antisones tell a student, "You think Socrates had answers." He didn't. He had discipline. That was enough. And then he walked away. No notes. No scrolls. There was also Scribes. Scribes tried to capture Socrates not as a symbol, but as a man. He wrote a dialogue called The Tablet, not about Socrates, but about the soul's long journey toward wisdom. In it, there are teachers, guides, paths, but no hero, just slow realization. It was the closest anyone came, you thought, to capturing what it felt like to sit near Socrates, not to argue, not to follow, but to feel the shape of ignorance changing inside you. But even Scribes faded. His book was copied a few times, then less, then only remembered as a title in someone else's catalog. You often think about what didn't survive, not just the voices, but the moments, like the old potter whose shop sat at the edge of the marketplace. Socrates used to pass by him each morning, never stopped, not at first. But one day, the potter, half amused, half irritated, asked, "If you're so wise, tell me, what use is philosophy to someone who already knows how to make a living?" Socrates didn't answer. He just sat down beside the wheel and watched for an hour, then two. Finally, the potter said, "You're not going to speak." Socrates smiled. "I thought you already knew." You remember that story because it wasn't in any book. It was told to you by the potter's son, who later became your neighbor. A mundane thing, not profound, not quotable, but unforgettable. Plato's dialogues, now spreading across the cities, are read in corners of Egypt and the shores of Sicily. They are quoted in courts. They are debated in letters. But among the old listeners, the ones who had been there, they stir discomfort because they polish what was rough, complete what was meant to remain open. They give Socrates a clarity he never claimed. Even Xenophon, the soldier turned historian, tried to clean the image. He wrote a memorabilia of Socrates that portrayed him as a moral guide, a wise old man, a teacher of ethics. But that, too, missed something. You once overheard a man say, "The more they write about him, the less of him remains." And you believed. You now begin to wonder whether Socrates meant for anything to be preserved. He once said, as Plato recorded, "I neither know nor think I know." But what if even that was too neat? What if Socrates believed that all memory is distortion? That to truly understand something is to carry it unspoken, to let it shape your life rather than your bookshelf. There is a kind of history that cannot be archived. It lives in the way someone pauses before speaking, in the way a person lets a question hang unanswered, in the choice to walk away rather than argue. You begin to see Socrates not as a teacher of philosophy, taste to us, of stillness, of the moment between thoughts. It has been nearly 30 years since his death. Most of the city has moved on. There are new teachers now, and new enemies. But sometimes, when you sit alone, recall the rhythm of his steps. He walked slowly, as if choosing his next sentence with his heels. You remember how he would tap his fingers on the stone bench? 4 times, always 4, before beginning to speak. You remember that, at dusk, his voice changed, became softer, like it was no longer trying to be heard, but to echo inside someone. And you wonder what kind of man knows he will be remembered and says nothing he wants written. What kind of mind builds no monument but reshapes all others? One day, a young student barely older than you were back then approaches your stall. He asks about Socrates, not the philosopher, but the man. What did he look like? He asks. How did he sound? You search your memory, but your mouth stays closed, because those answers aren't in words. They're in how you watch, how you wait before replying, how you speak slowly, not to sound wise, but to leave space. You smile at the boy, then say, the most Socratic thing you can think of. That depends on what you mean by look like. And suddenly, it begins again. Not a doctrine, not a legacy, just a question, asked slowly, carefully, without fear, like a thread being handed to the next weaver, like a pause that never quite ends. By now, the voices that once gathered in the porticos have faded. The city has changed. The markets are louder. The questions are fewer. The Stoa, where Socrates once stood, is crumbling at the base, worn by wind and apathy alike. Tourists, in their own way, still come. Not in your time, but in one far after. They come not for philosophy, but for ruins. Stones are easier to understand than pauses. You have grown old. The boy who once listened through shutters has lived through 3 wars, to harvest famines and more political assemblies than you care to count. You've learned that ideas are like wind. They pass through people, sometimes changing the shape of a field, sometimes leaving only a shiver. But you've never stopped listening, and in listening, you became the final student, the quiet one, the invisible one, the one who never asked, but remembered everything, even what the others forgot. Socrates, they all agreed, had a strange relationship with silence. It wasn't emptiness. It was architecture. You remember an afternoon long ago when a merchant mocked him in the middle of a crowd, called him a fool, said he had no real trade, no real answers. The crowd laughed. Socrates just waited. He looked up at the sky, pointed at a passing cloud, and asked, "What shape is that?" The man shrugged. "A goat," he said. Socrates nodded. "And if it were a lion?" The man said nothing. Then Socrates asked no more questions. He just left. That silence, that refusal to argue further, taught more than any lecture could. Even now, decades later, you think about that moment whenever a younger man speaks too quickly. Many of the men who studied under Socrates tried to define what made him great. Plato said it was his logic. Antisthenes said it was his virtue. Even Xenophon said it was his ethics. But they all missed something. What made Socrates different wasn't the content of his thoughts. It was how little he insisted on them. He treated knowledge like sunlight, something you stood in together, something that didn't belong to anyone. You remember once hearing him say, "The truth is not a stone to be held. It's a shadow you notice only when the light hits at just the right angle." No one wrote that down, but you did. Not in ink, but in the way you lived. You eventually found work copying receipts at the tax office. It was a boring life, filled with numbers and signatures, but you never complained, because you had once listened to a man who made boredom noble. He said that the gods do not need admiration, only attention. That to truly know something, you must notice it in repetition. That a man who could sweep same floor every day and still think new thoughts while doing so was closer to wisdom than any general or politician. You remembered this every time you swept your stall, and in that way you became his student without ever speaking to him. Decades after Socrates' death, Athens tried to forget. New schools rose. The Stoics built their systems. The Epicureans focused on pleasure. Even Aristotle, once Plato's own student, founded his own lyceum, but they all missed the texture of the original moment because they were trying to build from Socrates, when all Socrates ever tried to do was unbuild. He didn't want disciples. He wanted doubters. And so, in trying to preserve him, they betrayed him just a little. You understood that better than most, because you saw what the others ignored. The way Socrates paused mid-sentence to let others fill the silence. The way he turned a lecture into a circle. The way he smiled when someone contradicted him, as if he were happy to lose the point. You still remember his sandals, not the ideas, the shoes, worn, dry leather. The strap broke once, and he tied it with reed. People often write about gods and ethics, but no one ever writes about sandals. And yet, you'd think it is the sandals that prove who he really was. A man whose feet touched the same stones as everyone else, who never raised himself above the common earth, who made questions out of dirt in dinner and walking. Once, you overheard him ask a street vendor, "Do you think a coin is more real than the thought that made you want it?" And then he just smiled and bought figs. You have outlived, almost, all his students now. Plato is dead. His academy still stands, but is filled with arguments that would have made Socrates laugh. Xenophon died in Corinth, an old soldier still writing memoirs that made everything seem clearer than it ever was. Even the children of the students now quote him without knowing why, and yet something odd is happening. You hear the cadence of Socratic questioning in unexpected places, in an old woman at the well asking what fairness means if the rich draw cleaner water, in a baker telling her apprentice to explain why the bread must be kneaded twice, not just to repeat the rule, in a child asking his mother if a promise made in play counts as a real one. None of them read Plato, but they ask the same kind of questions, and in that, Socrates survives, not in the books, but in the tone of thought, in the courage to admit, "I don't know." In the final days of your life, you keep no scrolls. You write no memoir. Your sons do not understand why you sometimes stare at an empty wall for hours. They think you are forgetting, but you are remembering, not the words, the gaps between them. You remember how Socrates said the soul was drawn toward the good, not because it recognized it, but because it hungered for something it didn't yet know. And you think, what if that hunger is the soul? What if philosophy is not the pursuit of answers, but the art of never being done? You close your eyes, and you listen for the silence, the one that always came after the question, the one that changed everything, quietly, forever. You may be walking through the agora, but you wouldn't know it at first. The stones are the same worn smooth by generations of sandals, chariots, and storms. The shadows fall across the colonnades, just as they always have. Vendors still shout their wares in the morning, and the smell of olives and salted fish still drifts between stalls. But something is missing, something you can't quite name. There are no arguments. No one is standing on the plinth near the fountain to ask whether justice is a matter of law or heart. A curious youth has stopped a politician to ask, but what if the law is unjust? No one laughs mid-debate, struck by the absurdity of their own certainty. The questions are gone, not answered, just gone, and no decree was ever issued. No law passed, no arrests made. But in the years following the trial and execution of Socrates, something changed in Athens, not with noise or battle, with quiet, with subtle rearrangements of civic life, with the kind of silence that filled the public space, not like wind, but like ash, taut invisible, residual, and slowly choking. It started, as such things often do, not with a man, but with a mood. The city had survived war. Barely the Peloponnesian. War had left it broken, weakened, full of bitter men and brittle alliances. The 30 tyrants had come and gone. Democracy, restored with cautious optimism, limped along like an old horse pretending to be young. People were tired of chaos and questions, especially philosophical ones began to feel like chaos in disguise. The old men in the agora whispered that too much thinking had ruined Athens, that sophist had unstitched the morals of the youth, that cleverness had replaced courage, and skepticism had hollowed the laws. It wasn't a purge, exactly. No prisons filled. No books were burned. But one by one, the questioners found themselves without a place to speak. Take, for example, the teacher. Villain. He wasn't famous. He didn't write anything that survived. But you remember him. He had a habit of asking his students to bring him rumors from their households, what their parents believed, feared, or mocked. Then he'd ask, "And why do you think that is?" He never criticized. He just pushed. After the trial of Socrates, Villain moved his class away from the agora. He said it was to find a quieter space, but you later heard he'd been asked unofficially not to disturb the tone of civic discussion. He began to walk more quickly in public. He stopped speaking in metaphors. He smiled more. Eventually, he left Athens. Then there was Alethea, the scroll copyist's daughter, bright, sharp-tongued, and deeply curious. She once asked a visiting magistrate if the city's tax on imported oils was a form of theft, if it benefited only the elite. No one answered. But the next week, her father lost his contract with the academy. She married a grain merchant in Thasos. No one heard from her again. It became understood, not by law, but by habit, that questioning the form of things was acceptable. You could debate military budgets. You could criticize the water rates, could even mock specific politicians, as long as you did it with a smile and a wine jug in hand. But to question why things are as they are, that was different to ask if virtue could exist without law, if law could exist without consensus, if the gods agreed with the citizens' assembly. Those questions had become impolite, not illegal, just unwelcome, and that, you realized, was far more effective. You once sat beside a man named Damon, not a philosopher. Baker, he said. After Socrates, it was as if every stone in the agora was turned slightly inward. Same paths, but you walked them differently. You never forgot that, because Damon was right. The purge of questioners did not come through flames or blades. It came through the angle of the stones, through small changes to curriculum, to funding, to gathering permits. One day, a young man, who might have stayed to argue, after assembly, simply didn't, not because they were forbidden, but because the air had thickened, because something unspoken, now hung over every raised hand. The statue of Harmodius and Aristocaton, the Tyrannicides, still stood in the square, gleamed in the sun. People still honored them with wreaths on the anniversary of their strike against Hipparchus, but no one asked why tyranny now looked like consensus. No one asked whether a city that forbade questions through omission was any different from one that outlawed them. Openly, the city had remembered the names of those who fought with swords, but it had begun to erase the names of those who fought with questions, and in that forgetting, it rewrote its own soul. Even the drama changed. Once, the city had loved satire. Aristophanes could mock Socrates to his face, make him a fool dangling in a basket. Chasing cloud sand, no one stopped him. But now, the plays turned safer. Gods were invoked more gently. Politicians were parodied less directly. Tragedies leaned heavier on fate than on choice. The theater became a place for catharsis, not challenge. And though the seats remained full, something vital had emptied out. You once overheard a chorus boy say, "The audience doesn't want to think anymore. They want to nod." And he was right. Nodding had replaced asking. It's easy to imagine that philosophy would move elsewhere. And it did, in part. Plato opened the academy. Others followed suit. But something was lost in the relocation. The agora had once been where cobblers and senators shared space with thinkers, where a slave could overhear a thought that changed his life, where a market woman could interrupt a dialogue with a better point than the teacher. When philosophy left the streets, it became safer, but it also became less alive, less irritating, less dangerous. And you've come to believe that it's the danger that made it matter. Now, decades later, you still walk the agora. Not every day. Your legs don't allow it. But often enough, you listen for questions. Sometimes you catch a whisper, an apprentice asking a craftsman whether the gods care about symmetry. A mother asking a child why they fear the dark when they sleep in a lit room. These are the embers, small, almost imperceptible, but still burning. You wonder, what would Socrates say if he stood here again? Would he ask why so few people linger? Would he question why the fountains are louder than the conversations? Or would he just sit quietly until someone asked him something? And what would that question be? Would it even be allowed? Or would it vanish like smoke into ash, to ash? It was not just the people who changed after the trial of Socrates. It was the places, the agora, a corner, once a breathing map of the city's arguments, began to harden. The columns still stood, but fewer lingered in their shade. Stalls that once doubled as impromptu lecture halls now served only as quiet vending corners. The spaces where thinkers once sat on stone steps, pulling threads of logic with strangers, slowly became zones of transaction. Thought was no longer considered public property, was something best kept inside, or inside institutions. And so the city evolved. Not through revolution, but through gradual constraint, a shifting of weight, a redirection of the eyes, an architecture of avoidance. Walk the edges of the agora today, and you'll still find the remains of what was once the most powerful open-air idea engine in the world, the Royal Stoa. For instance, still leans toward the past. It once housed the city's chief, magistrates, those charged with protecting the laws, and it was from here that Miletus, one of Socrates' accusers, had likely stood, signing the charge that would echo through centuries. But no one discusses that here now. The space is swept clean. Even the old laws, carved into stone and placed near the stoa for public reading, became harder to read, not because they were erased, but because they were no longer studied. Newer decrees were added in front of the old, and in the shade, unvisited. The older letters faded. You realize something subtle. A law forgotten is not much different than a law repealed, and when no one asks what the law means anymore, it might as well not exist. There was a time when a boy could walk through the agora and leave with a question, echoing in his mind all day. Now, the same boy leaves with a loaf of bread or a coin for his father's table. The shift is not in function, it is in attention. The city still works, feeds its people, it debates taxes and roads. Occasionally, it remembers its victories, mourns its losses. But no one wants to be asked if Athens is still Athens, because the answer might be complicated, and in complicated answers, fear finds space. A sculptor named Phaedrus once tried to carve a relief depicting the trial of Socrates. He chose to show not the moment of condemnation, but the silence in the room after Socrates asked, "What is piety?" He tried to capture the faces not of the judges, but of the people, the onlookers, the students, expressions caught between loyalty and self-preservation. Phaedrus submitted the work for public display. It was rejected. Too political, the magistrates said. Too recent, he was not fined, not punished, simply asked to reconsider future themes. He turned to mythological scenes afterward. Athena and Poseidon, Heracles and the lion. Stories no one questioned, because questioning stories had become a liability. Another teacher, Socrates, had a habit of asking his students to write both sides of an argument, even ones they disliked. One boy refused, said it felt dishonest. Timocrates replied, "It is not dishonest to understand your opponent. It is dishonest to pretend they have no reason." That exchange was reported, anonymously. Timokritos was not dismissed, but his stipend was cut. His classroom was relocated to the edge of the city, where the stables began. Fewer students came. When asked how he was doing, he said, "The horses are less defensive, okay?" And he kept teaching. You meet a mason named Eubulus, who remembers Socrates not from the courtroom, but from a rainstorm. He saw him sheltering under the roof of the Matroon, laughing with a vendor about whether fate could be forecast by the flight of birds, even when soaked. He looked like he was in control, Eubulus said, not because he had answers, but because he never feared being without them. And then he whispered, looking over his shoulder, "We are not allowed to look lost anymore." That, perhaps, is the truest line you've heard in years, because somewhere along the way, Athens decided that doubt was weakness, and the quiet purge wasn't of people, but of permission. At the temple of Hephaestus, the god of craftsmen, the priest now offers shorter blessings, fewer parables, no mention of justice or inquiry. He blesses strong arms and steady hands. He blesses productivity, and the people are content. They are tired of metaphor. The city wants outcomes, not insights. It wants stone, not speculation. Even the schools of philosophy have changed. The academy still stands, but inside its walls, the tone has shifted. Plato is aging. His students are more structured now. Debates are organized into formal sequences. Questions are categorized. Inquiry is professionalized. No one interrupts anymore. No one stands up mid-lecture and asks, "But how do you know?" Because no one wants to be seen as reckless. You remember how Socrates once said, "Wisdom begins in wonder," and wonder has become inefficient. You walk past a mural near the old city gate. It used to show Theseus lifting a stone to find his father's sword. Now it has been painted over with a map of trade routes, useful, informative, completely uncontroversial. It reflects the mood of the age. Show us what brings profit, not what brings pause. You wonder if the boy who lifts the stone would still bother to check what's beneath it, or if he'd just measure it for quarrying. Not all is lost. Here and there, you hear flickers of something older. Two children arguing about whether the moon follows them or they follow it. An old woman at the market refusing to accept a price until the seller explains how it was set. A potter debating with his apprentice whether form or function should rule the shape of a jar. These moments are small, not performances, not lectures, but in them. The spirit of questioning lives, not as a political act, but as a human one. You sit beneath the plane tree where Socrates once spoke. The tree has changed, but the roots reach the same soil. You think about how laws do not only reside in scrolls and courts, they live in customs, in reactions, in what is allowed to be asked, and more importantly, in what is quietly discouraged. Athens did not outlaw philosophy. It just changed the weather around it, made it harder to breathe, and in that way, the city wrote new laws, not in marble, but in ash, soft, silent, suffocating, still drifting, still settling, still here, still here. By now, you understand that Athens did not burn its questioners, simply buried them, not beneath stone, beneath habit, the habits of deflection, of courteous disinterest, of structural forgetting. You realize this as you walk the long road, between the agora and the Nix the hill, where the assembly once met. In the days before and just after Socrates, this was a place where voices collided. A citizen could climb the bema, stand against a sea of peers, and say something dangerous. It mattered enough. Now the Nix is overgrown. The path is clear, but the hill is mostly empty. Even the sound of sandals on rock feels too loud here. It is not abandoned. It is just bypassed, like so many of the places that once allowed ideas to echo. The echo now is smaller, closer, tucked within homes, in quiet corners, behind doors slightly ajar. Philosophy survived, but it withdrew. It had to die. Plato tried to carry the fire. At the academy, he wrote dialogues where Socrates still speaks, still needles, still holds the candle of unknowing up to the faces of men who thought they understood the world. But even Plato learned to write with caution. His Socrates was often veiled in metaphor, shrined in abstraction. He wasn't hiding the questions, he was preserving them, making them difficult to reach, but impossible to extinguish. And even that was a concession, The streets could no longer bear that kind of flame. Only the page could carry it now. Others followed. Snethon offered his own accounts of Socrates, but filtered safer, more palatable. Not lies, but not risks, either. Socrates, who taught ethics and moderation, not revolution. It was the version people could live with, and perhaps that was necessary. When a city fears ideas, even memory becomes negotiation. How do you remember a man whose questions threatened the entire scaffolding of civic pride? Do you preserve his words with the spaces where he was not allowed to speak? Do you commemorate him or pretend his death was necessary? The answer, for most, was silence. And silence, as history often shows, is not neutrality. It is decision wearing, quiet as a cloak. You find yourself in a potter's workshop, one of the few still bearing the marks of older styles. The master here, an elderly man with dry hands and a low voice, remembers his father speaking about the old days. He tells you something strange, that after Socrates died, some families quietly began using his likeness on the bottoms of pots, not to honor him, but to ensure that his face touched fire every time a vessel was fired. He asked too much, his father once said. Let him burn below. You don't know if that story is true, but it tells the truth nonetheless, that some people didn't want to forget Socrates. They wanted to punish him forever, even in clay. But not everyone buried him in resentment. Some buried him in gardens, in secret schools, in conversations that started innocently and led gently, cautiously into deeper places. A merchant might ask a friend whether justice had a price. A soldier might wonder aloud whether courage meant obedience or resistance. The city's laws had closed no doors, but people had learned which ones not to open, and still, some opened them anyway, slowly, carefully, sometimes even without knowing, because the impulse to ask is not learned. It is human, and it resurfaces, always. Years later, Aristotle would create his own system, less dialectical, more observational. He studied biology, politics, poetry. He tried to build a framework where questions could live safely inside structure, and he succeeded for a while. But even he had to leave Athens after the death of Alexander the Great. Aristotle sensed the tides shifting again. He is said to have fled the city to to avoid another crime against philosophy. He had learned the lesson of Socrates, that cities do not always kill philosophers with hemlock. Sometimes they do it with pressure, and sometimes a philosopher leaves before the noose tightens. But what of the agora now? What happens when a city forgets not just a man, but the way he thought? What fills the silence left behind? More laws, more structure, more ceremony, but less conversation. The shops still open. The courts still function. The festivals still flare, but the air is thinner. It lacks the friction that once sparked understanding. Without that friction, the city runs, but it doesn't breathe. In the years that follow, Athens would continue to birth ideas, to teach, to legislate, but the question Socrates asked, the dangerous one, the one too deep to print on a wall, would never be answered, because it wasn't a question you could answer. Only carry, only repeat. What is the good life? Not how should we live, okay, which is political, but why live at all, okay, which is philosophical. That was the question that haunted the silence, that made the ash settle slowly, forever. And when you listen closely, you can still hear it, in the footsteps that echo louder than the words, in the benches that remain empty, in the spaces between speeches. You think of the stone benches where the sophist once sat, empty now, not forbidden, just unused. You wonder what it would take to fill them again, not with students, but with questions, not with orators, but with uncertainty, because the city is still here. The columns still stand, and somewhere in the stone, the voice of Socrates is still vibrating, not in volume, but in persistence. As you leave the agora one final time, you pause at the edge of Pot, the Thalos, the old roundhouse where the city's council once dined and slept inside. It's quiet. The fire has long since gone cold, but you think of the laws written not in ink or decree, but in custom, and how those laws shaped more lives than any statute ever carved in stone. You whisper a question, just to hear it out loud. What are we not allowed to wonder anymore? No one answers, but the stones seem to listen, and sometimes that's enough. It's enough. In the years after Socrates' death, Athens did not fall silent overnight. The city still hummed with commerce, with laughter, with the rhythm of sandal against stone. The marketplace rang with haggling voices, and children still tossed stones, in games older than memory. But something had changed, and not everyone could name it. There was, however, a man at the edge of the square who never tried to name it. He simply sat, each morning, on the same low step outside a dye stall, watching the people pass. He did not speak unless spoken to, and even then, his replies came slowly, deliberate, cautious, and brief. His name, if anyone still remembered, it was Epiphanes. He had once been a student of Socrates, not one of the famous ones, not Plato, not Xenophon, just a quiet boy who had listened, not written, who remembered not the exact words spoken, but the feeling of the pauses between them. When Socrates died, Epiphanes had been 17. When Plato opened the academy, he was already 32, old and too tired of performance, and so he came to this step, and stayed there, not to teach, but simply to observe. And in time, people began to treat him like a fixture of the agora. They'd pass him as they would pass the olive trees or the cracked stones with fading inscriptions. Yet every so often, someone would stop, and when they did, something strange happened. They often found themselves talking more than they intended to. One man came to complain about his son, who refused to follow the family trade. Epiphanes said nothing. The man went on about disappointment, about duty, about the cost of apprenticeship. Still, no answer. The silence stretched. Then Epiphanes finally said, "What was your trade before your father pulled you into his?" The man paused. He didn't answer. He left. 2 days later, he returned. It's quieter. He brought his son with him. Neither of them spoke to Athens, but they both sat down and listened. Athens never advertised himself as a philosopher, never called himself a teacher. He did not stand. He did not declare. But somehow, word of him spread. They began calling him the quiet one. In Athens was not always a compliment, but in this case, it stuck like reverence. Not because he possessed secrets, but because he refused to perform them. He was uninterested in applause, unbothered by correction. He had no scrolls, no followers, no ambitions. He had, it seemed, only one purpose: to be present and in a city still recovering from the aftershocks of executed inquiry. That was enough to stir unease. The city magistrates began to take note, not because he caused trouble, but because he attracted pause. And in a society running toward reconstruction, pause was unwelcome. The officials spoke in private. What does he teach? Nothing. Then why do they call him a teacher? Because people leave him thinking differently. That's worse. They sent a minor bureaucrat to ask questions. The man approached Athens, who was eating bread dipped in oil, staring quietly at the marketplace. Are you offering instruction? The bureaucrat asked. No, said Athens, but people say you change minds. Athens looked up and answered softly. Minds change all the time. Some while walking, some while dreaming. The bureaucrat frowned. We've had trouble before with thinkers. I don't think aloud, said Athens. I watch. Then, what good are you? Athens shrugged. That night, nothing was written down. No charges filed, but a city clerk noted in a ledger. Potential influence, passive, and influence. However, passive was still unsettling. Some began to test him. A young man from the academy came to argue. He brought a scroll under his arm, hoping to correct a silent man with logic and clever rhetoric. He began with an accusation. You allowed the ignorant to mistake you for a sage. Athens said nothing. I have studied the tenets of epistemology, the youth continued. I can name the errors in your approach. Still, nothing. The young man grew frustrated. You sit as if above us all. And finally, Athens looked up. I sit, he said, because I am tired. The young man left, and in the stillness that followed, older woman nearby chuckled quietly and said, he teaches more with silence than others do with speeches. But Athens never smiled at praise. In fact, when he heard it, he often stopped visiting the square for days. Some believed he was sick. Others whispered he was meditating. The truth was far simpler. He disliked attention because he remembered what had happened to the man who'd asked too many questions. And he knew that even admiration could be dangerous. Admiration becomes echo. Echo becomes rumor. Rumor becomes threat. He had seen it before. He had watched Socrates die, not because he was wrong, but because he refused to fit. Athens had no desire to be a symbol, so he erased himself in plain sight. And yet, people still came, because Athens had not forgotten how to listen. It had simply grown cautious. Athens became the city's mirror. He spoke little, but what he said lingered. A merchant once asked him what justice meant. Athens replied, justice is what remains when no one is watching. A potter asked how to raise a stubborn daughter. Socrates answered, ask her how she would raise you. A widow asked why grief never ended. Athens said, because love doesn't. None of these statements were revolutionary. None would be carved in stone, but they traveled on foot, by word of mouth, whispered from cousin to neighbor, and slowly, without his asking, a kind of quiet school formed around him. A school with no walls, no doctrine, only presence. One day, boy came and sat next to Athens. He was perhaps 12, thin, thighs too old for his age. He said nothing. For hours, Athens did not ask him to leave. Eventually, The boy spoke. Is it true that questions are dangerous? Ashaphanes nodded. Then why do people still ask them? Because silence is heavier, said Ashaphanes. The boy returned the next day, and the day after. He never asked more than one question, but he always left with less weight in his shoulders. He would grow up to teach mathematics, and though he never quoted Ashaphanes in public, he would tell his students, learn to be silent before you speak. Ashaphanes lived to old age. No monuments were built, no dialogues written, no philosophies codified, and yet, long after his death, when Athens once again began to tolerate thought, students of students would speak of him, not as a philosopher, but as a presence, the man who taught Athens how to breathe again. After the questions stopped, Ashaphanes never moved from that stone step, not because he was bound by tradition or held there by duty, but because he understood the power of a single, unchanged place in a city that was always turning over itself. Each morning, the same corner of the agora, he would arrive at first light, long before the fishmongers' blades hit their stalls, before the sandal makers opened their shutters. The sky above would still be soft with dewlight, and the city not yet awake enough to posture. And in that quiet hour, Ashaphanes would sit and do nothing. It wasn't a meditative stillness, the kind you'd learn from the East or from some school promising enlightenment. It was the stillness of attention. He noticed the way the wind moved cloth on the market stalls, the way the crows picked only the stale barley from the sweepings, the way a man's voice changed when speaking to a creditor compared to a friend, the way women stopped laughing when a soldier walked by. Ashaphanes absorbed the city in its most boring truth. He listened, and by mid-morning, others did too, but not because they came to learn anything. They came to think, and that was dangerous. There was a woman named Alefido, of a minor architect, mother of two, and known in the city for making inexpensive sandals that still somehow outlasted the more fashionable imports from Chios. Elaf sat next to Ashaphanes every other day. She never brought a stool, never asked him for answers. She simply brought stories, not gossip, not grand ideas, just details. My son has been quiet lately, she said once. He watches the dog more than he speaks. Do you think something is wrong? Ashaphanes had torn a piece of bread in half and passed her one part without speaking. They ate in silence. When she finished, she said, maybe quiet is its own kind of answer. He nodded once. She never asked again, but she sat closer from then on. Another man, Periphanes, came to mock Ashaphanes. He was a clerk in the council's record office, used two ledgers, rules, clarity. He saw Ashaphanes as a man wasting time, possibly misleading the weak-minded. What is it you teach, exactly? Periphanes asked, loud enough for nearby vendors to hear. Ashaphanes looked up slowly, then pointed at the stone beneath him. This? What? Stone? No. Stillness. Periphanes laughed, and Ashaphanes said no more. But days later, Periphanes returned more quietly. This time, he brought a papyrus sheet folded into 4 parts, with questions written on each corner. He handed it to Ashaphanes and left without waiting for a reply. The next morning, Ashaphanes returned the same sheet, blank. But on the corner, a 5th question had been added in Periphanes, it is said. Never mocked again. None of these conversations were recorded, but the echoes lived in routines, in the way merchants paused before setting prices, and how craftsmen asked themselves why they made things the way they did. Not every visitor spoke aloud. Some came just to sit near the silence, because by then, the silence itself had become a kind of library. One you didn't need permission to enter, only patience. You must understand, this was not a time of cultural flowering in Athens. This was a time of repair. The war with Sparta had ended in loss. The empire was fractured. The memory of tyranny still lingered like smoke in civic assemblies. Men were afraid of voices, especially voices that could not be predicted. The city had killed Socrates, not because of what he said, but because it feared what others might do after hearing him. In the aftermath, all speech was cautious. Even poets were careful with metaphors. And so, in that cautious world, Athens offered not a philosophy, but space, a rare kind of political gesture in itself, one without slogans, leaders, or ideologies, a gesture so passive that it could not be accused of anything. And so it endured, quietly, one spring. A group of travelers from the islands came to the city. Among them was a young man named Socrates, who claimed he had studied under a Cypriot mystic who could read the future in coin vibrations. He was loud, confident, fluent in 3 dialects. A showman, Socrates heard about the silent teacher and made it his mission to confront him. He called it an exercise in exposure. He wanted to show that wisdom did not live in mutens. He arrived with a crowd. Athens was eating lentils. Socrates stood and announced, "If you are wise, then answer this. Is knowledge better used or hidden?" Athens wiped his mouth slowly, then stood up not to speak, but to walk away. The crowd followed him. Confused, he walked to a broken cistern behind a pottery stall, knelt, and pulled from its cracked edge a small fig that had fallen through a lattice above. He held it up. A child reached out and took it. Athens sat back down, and the crowd slowly did too. Socrates left that evening, and those who had followed him returned, one by one, to Athens stone. The officials never arrested him because he never broke laws. He owned nothing. He led no group. He gave no sermons. He made no claims. There was no evidence against him, just influence. But influence leaves no record when spoken, in glances and pauses. So they tolerated him, and in doing so, preserved something older than Athens itself. The idea that not all resistance needs to shout. Some of it simply outlasts. Athens never claimed to be continuing Socrates' work, but others saw it in him, not in what he said, but in what he allowed others to think. He reminded the city that philosophy is not a luxury of the elite. It is the residue left behind when the world stops making sense. It grows in the cracks between transactions, in the questions no one answers, in the space between what a city claims it values and what it actually does. And long after he died, no one knows exactly when his name continued to be whispered, not in academies, but in kitchens and near fire pits and beside wells. They said, he asked nothing, but I answered. They said, he listened until I heard myself. They said, I didn't learn anything new. I just learned what I already knew. And maybe that is the truest teaching, to awaken what was already alive, without ever declaring it in time. A boy born generations later would visit the same step. He was studying under a philosopher from Rhodes, and had heard rumors about the silent man who used to sit by the dyer stall. The stall was gone. The step cracked, but the boy sat there anyway and listened to nothing, to everything, because silence, once planted, does not die. It waits for the next listener, for the next unsaid question, and maybe even for you. In the years after Athens quietly vanished from the agora, no one knew precisely when he had stopped coming. There was no farewell, no final visit marked with ceremony or public recognition. He did not leave behind students in robes, no wax tablets of cryptic doctrine, no altar to his memory. His departure was as silent as his life had been, and yet the absence was felt. It revealed itself in the moments people waited for him. Returned. The potter who glanced at the cornerstone each morning, the olive vendor who left a second cup on the bench out of habit, the child who sat in his place one day and found that the view felt older than the sky. No one declared him dead. He simply became part of the Agora itself, a memory you walked past, a presence that didn't fade, only softened, because some kinds of influence do not demand to be remembered. They persist by being repeated. What remained, more than anything, was his method, or rather, his lack of one. He had no theory, no argument, no name system. But in the years that followed, Athenians developed a habit, a quiet one. They began to leave more space in conversation. Where once the agora had been full of shouts, of political boasts, and philosophical sparring, it now held more pauses, more unspoken questions. If Socrates had provoked answers, Epiphanes had nurtured questions, and that had changed the tempo of thought. Even the way young citizens were trained in rhetoric began to shift. One teacher, Philodemos, began his lessons not with speeches, but with long moments of breath. He would light a small oil lamp at the center of the classroom and wait for the students to notice it. Then, only then, would he ask, "Why does this flame hold your attention more than my voice?" They never had the same answer. But that was the point. A minor court clerk named Menedemos later wrote in a surviving letter that Epiphanes taught a kind of honesty one could not rehearse. He claimed that the silent man had once looked at him after a particularly difficult case, one where a child was denied inheritance due to a missing tablet hand, said nothing. But in that silence, Menedemos felt something shift. He never explained what that shift was, only that he afterward took greater care when organizing evidence, more care in listening, less trust in the assumptions of law. And years later, when he became head clerk, he revised the courtroom seating so that witnesses no longer stood behind barriers. "I don't know what justice is," he told his colleagues, "but I think it begins when someone feels seen." They called the change the Epiphanes adjustment. The name stuck. Over time, what little was known about the silent teacher's life began to blur. Some said he had once been a soldier who vowed never to kill again. Others believed he was a former student of Socrates who had watched the trial and chosen stillness as a form of protest. There were rumors that he had been a priest who had lost his faith, a sailor who had survived a shipwreck and vowed to never speak of it, or even a foreigner who understood no Greek at all and used his muteness as a shield against detection. None of these stories had proof, but none of them mattered, because the power of Epiphanes had never been in who he was. It was in what he allowed others to become. He was not a figure of authority. He was a mirror, not always flattering, but always honest. One woman, a weaver named Tryphosa, kept a small cloth scrap with a stitched circle in the middle. She told her grandchildren that the circle represented the place where the quiet man sat. Every year on the spring equinox, she placed the cloth on a stone near the marketplace and set a bowl of water on it. When asked why, she said only, "Because water listens." The ritual spread, just in a small way. A gesture not to summon anything, just to remember that stillness had once been part of the city's rhythm. The academy and the lyceum never mentioned Athens. His name does not appear in Plato's dialogues or Aristotle's treatises, and yet, in some of the more obscure writings by their students, you see shadows of him. In one fragment attributed to a later Platonist, there are those who teach through diagrams and those who teach through delay. And another, a city's virtue is not measured by its orators, but by the space it gives to silence. Neither, quote, names its source, but both feel like echoes, like someone once sat near a man who said nothing, can remembered it forever. Eventually, a small group of young thinkers, disillusioned with the complexities of dialectic, began meeting at the edge of the city. Beyond the Diplon gate, under the ruins of an old colonnade, they called themselves the Acromatoi, the listeners. They had no texts, only observations. One would speak of how beggars knew where to sit, based on the smell of the stones. Another described how birds avoided purchase near certain statues, as if the material offended them. They never argued, only recorded, and after each meeting, it would sit in stillness, facing one another, saying nothing. Their goal was not understanding, but recognition. They disbanded after a few seasons, but their records show up later in Roman collections of curious Athenian practices. Most dismissed them, but one Roman philosopher, Seneca, kept a copy. He called it a humbling text. What does it mean to live in a city that once killed a man for speaking and later revered a man for not speaking at all? Perhaps it means the city learned, or perhaps it only changed the shape of its fear. Socrates was a hammer. Athens was water. The city cracked under the first. It adapted to the second. And in that adaptation, something survived. Not a school, not a system, but a habit. A small, quiet reflex in the soul of the city, to sometimes ask, why am I saying this? And to sometimes stop in time. Athens became less of a man and more of a concept. Stonecutters would joke about pulling in Athens when they chose not to correct a client's bad design. Bakers whispered the name when they refused to argue with customers over prices and children. When asked what they learned in school, sometimes said, I learned like Athens meant. I heard what was not said. No monuments were built for him, but some believe the cracked step he used to sit on still exists, half buried near the base of a broken column, covered in chalk dust and sunlight. If you go early enough in the morning before the city truly wakes, and sit there without expectation, you might feel something, not presence, not revelation, just a slowing, a listening, a return, and perhaps that is all any teacher can offer. Not a truth, not a path, but a place to be quiet, to be seen, to think what you are already thinking, but more clearly, more slowly, more humanly. And in a world of endless noise, maybe that is the most radical teaching of all.